The arrogant arrival. Fleet Commander Vexthor stood on the bridge of the Kraxan Empire's flagship, the Eternal Dawn, his 4 eyes fixed on the blue-green planet filling the viewscreen. Behind him, his crew worked in perfect silence, their crystalline tablets humming with tactical data and invasion protocols. Earth, as the natives called it, was meant to be nothing more than another routine conquest for the most advanced civilization in the known galaxy. Preliminary scans complete. Commander reported his second-in-command, Sub-Commander Zura. Her voice carried the distinctive metallic tone of all Kraxan officers, engineered for maximum clarity in combat situations. Their military technology is primitive. Most remarkable weapons appear to be chemical propellant projectiles and crude fusion devices. Vexthor's upper lip curled in what passed for a smile among his species. Projectile weapons. How quaint. Show me their most numerous combat vehicles. The main screen shifted to display images of Earth's tank divisions. Massive metal boxes crawling on endless linked plates of steel, rotating turrets housing long tubes that spat metal shells using controlled explosions. The bridge crew couldn't contain their amusement, several letting out the high-pitched trills that served as Kraxan laughter. They still used fossil fuels, one tactical officer noted with obvious disdain. The exhaust signatures are unmistakable. These vehicles would have been obsolete by Kraxan standards 5,000 cycles ago. Another added. Their armor couldn't even deflect our civilian mining lasers. Commander Vexthor raised a hand for silence, though his own amusement was evident in the purple flush of his neck membranes. Let's not be entirely dismissive. These humans have shown remarkable adaptability in their short civilization. We'll give them the courtesy of a formal surrender demand, as protocol requires. But Earth's response to the Kraxan Empire's demands was not what anyone aboard the Eternal Dawn expected. Instead of the immediate capitulation that most primitive species offered when confronted with vastly superior technology, the humans sent back a simple message. We decline your generous offer. Come and take it. The invasion began as a textbook operation. Kraxan dropships pierced Earth's atmosphere, their energy shields easily deflecting the primitive missiles and projectiles launched against them. The first wave targeted military installations, their plasma cannons reducing modern aircraft to slag and sophisticated communications arrays to molten puddles. What puzzled the Kraxan tactical analysts was the apparent lack of resistance from Earth's armored divisions. Satellite imagery showed hundreds of tank formations being loaded onto massive transport vehicles, but instead of moving to engage, they were retreating to remote locations. Old military bases were being reopened, long-abandoned underground facilities were showing new signs of activity. They're hiding their obsolete weapons, Sub-Commander Zura reported, her tone suggesting she found the whole situation beneath her dignity. Perhaps they hope to preserve them as museum pieces after our victory. But Colonel Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force saw something the aliens had missed entirely. As she stood in the vast underground chamber of Site Oscar 7, one of dozens of Cold War-era facilities now humming with activity, she watched teams of engineers swarming over rows of restored tanks. These weren't the modern composite armored vehicles that the Kraxan had so easily destroyed in the first wave. These were older, simpler machines. The M60 Patton, she explained to the gathered tank crews, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. The T-72, the Leopard 1, Chieftain, Type 74, machines that were built to fight a very different kind of war. And that's exactly why they're going to work. A young lieutenant raised his hand. Ma'am, with all respect, these tanks are museum pieces. The aliens are laughing at us for even having them. Chen smiled. Let them laugh. Our modern tanks failed because they rely too heavily on electronic systems that the Kraxan can easily disable. But these, she patted the solid steel flank of a nearby Patton. These are purely mechanical beasts. No computer targeting, no electronic countermeasures, no systems to hack or disable. Just steel, fire, and human determination. What the Kraxan Empire didn't understand couldn't understand through their lens of technological superiority was that humanity had spent nearly a century perfecting the art of tank warfare. These weren't just weapons. They were the distillation of countless battles, of hard-learned lessons written in blood and victory. Every angle of their armor, every mechanism in their loading systems, every aspect of their design had been tested in real combat. As the first month of occupation drew to a close, Commander Vexthor was growing increasingly confident. The humans' modern military lay in ruins, their governments were in disarray, and their population centers were under Kraxan control. The fact that they had hidden away their primitive armored vehicles seemed like a final admission of defeat. He couldn't have been more wrong. In bunkers and underground bases across the planet, thousands of tank crews were completing their crash courses in operating these mechanical warriors. Engineers had made only minimal modifications. Better seals against electromagnetic pulses, simplified systems that could run without any electronic components, and shells that had been carefully redesigned based on the limited data they had gathered about Kraxan shield frequencies. The humans had a saying that the Kraxan were about to learn. Sometimes the old ways are best. And in the darkness before dawn, the first rumble of tracks on concrete echoed through Site Oscar 7 as Colonel Chen gave the order they'd all been waiting for. Operation Rust and Thunder is go. Roll out. The Kraxan Empire was about to discover that their laughter had been premature. Very premature indeed. Operation Rust and Thunder. The first Kraxan patrol never saw it coming. Their hover tanks glided smoothly through the mountain pass, energy shields humming quietly in the pre-dawn light. The alien soldiers inside barely paid attention to their sensors. After all, what threat could these primitives pose? Their complacency proved fatal. The ground erupted beneath them as concealed M60 patterns burst from carefully camouflaged positions. The ancient tanks had been buried in the earth itself, covered with locally sourced materials that masked their heat signatures. Before the Kraxan could react, the human tanks fired their first salvos. What happened next would be debated in Kraxan military academies for centuries to come. The primitive kinetic rounds, simple depleted uranium shells, passed straight through the alien energy shields as if they weren't even there. The Kraxan had designed their defenses to stop energy weapons, plasma bolts, and even their own advanced projectiles. But these crude shells, moving at relatively slow velocities and carrying no electronic signatures, were invisible to their defensive systems. Direct hits, all targets. The cry went up through the human tank command network, not through easily jammed radio signals, but through a hastily restored system of wire-field telephones. Colonel Chen watched through binoculars as 3 Kraxan hover tanks crashed to the ground, their levitation systems shattered by the precise shots of her tank crews. "Just like we trained," she said quietly. "These machines might be old, but they're far from obsolete. Signal the next phase." Across Earth, similar scenes played out as carefully coordinated attacks struck Kraxan patrols. The aliens' technological superiority had become their weakness. They relied so heavily on their advanced systems that they had no fallback when those systems failed to detect a threat. Their hover tanks were faster and more maneuverable than Earth's tracked vehicles, but that meant nothing in carefully chosen engagement zones where humans controlled the battlefield. On the eternal dawn, Commander Vexthor received the reports with increasing alarm. "Impossible," he muttered, watching footage of another patrol's destruction. "Their weapons are archaic. They cannot be defeating our shields." "Sir," Sub-Commander Zara's voice had lost its usual confident edge. "Preliminary analysis suggests their weapons are too primitive for our defenses to detect. The shields are calibrated for energy weapons and smart projectiles. These are just metal shells. Then recalibrate the shields." Vexthor roared, his neck membranes flushing dark purple with rage. "It's not that simple, sir. The energy requirements to stop purely kinetic projectiles of that mass would be enormous. Our systems are designed to detect and deflect incoming energy signatures. These human weapons have no signature to detect." The humans pressed their advantage. Years of NATO war games had taught them the art of armor warfare, and now those lessons were being put to use against an entirely new enemy. Tank columns struck from hidden positions, used the terrain for cover, and disappeared before the Kraxan could mount an effective response. In the mountains of Afghanistan, restored Soviet-era T-72s emerged from cave systems to ambush alien supply lines. In the forests of Germany, Leopard 1s proved that their excellent optics and well-trained crews could acquire and hit targets even without modern fire control systems. In the deserts of Egypt, modified M60s demonstrated that sometimes the best technology is the technology you can fix with a wrench and determination. The Kraxan began to adapt, but slowly. Their entire military doctrine was based on technological superiority, and they struggled to fight an enemy that seemed to have stepped out of their own ancient history. They tried to jam communications that didn't exist, hack systems that were purely mechanical, and detect electronic signatures from vehicles that had none. At Site Oscar 7, Colonel Chen reviewed the latest battle reports with grim satisfaction. The restored tanks were exceeding all expectations, their simple reliability proving to be their greatest strength. When a modern tank was hit by Kraxan weapons, its sophisticated systems were fried beyond repair. But these old warriors could take hits and keep fighting, or be repaired with basic tools and spare parts. "They're calling for reinforcements," her intelligence officer reported. "We're intercepting quantum communications to the Kraxan home fleet. They're asking for ships equipped to fight primitive enemies." Chen allowed herself a small smile. How long will those reinforcements take to arrive? At least 3 months, given their closest battle fleet's position. Then we have 3 months to show them just how primitive we can be. Chen turned to the massive map table, where wooden models represented tank divisions and alien positions. No electronics, no signals to intercept, just the age-old art of war. Begin Phase 2. It's time to teach them why you should never laugh at someone else's weapons until you understand exactly what those weapons can do. In orbit, Commander Vexthor stared at the latest casualty reports with all 4 eyes wide in disbelief. The humans weren't just resisting, they were winning. His forces controlled the skies and space itself, but on the ground, they were being systematically dismantled by weapons that belonged in a museum. The next transmission he sent to the Kraxan High Command began with words he never thought he'd write. "Request immediate tactical support to counter extreme low-technology threat." These humans are not primitives. They are warriors who have mastered the art of turning simplicity into strength. As night fell over Earth's battlefields, the rumble of tank tracks continued to echo through valleys and forests. The humans had revealed their secret weapon, not some advanced technology, but the perfect combination of proven engineering, tactical wisdom, and the sheer determination to use whatever tools were available to defend their home. The Kraxan Empire was learning a lesson that many would-be conquerors had learned before. Sometimes the deadliest weapon is the one you dismiss as harmless. Tank tactics. Major James Wong crouched in the commander's cupola of his chieftain tank, studying the valley below through Cold War-era binoculars. Dawn was breaking over the Scottish Highlands, revealing 3 Kraxan hover tanks patrolling what used to be the A9 highway. In the 2 months since Operation Rust and Thunder began, the aliens had learned to be more cautious, but they still hadn't fully grasped the lessons of Earth's military history. "They're still moving in column formation," he muttered into the field telephone. "Just like we hoped. All units, execute Plan Bannockburn." The name wasn't chosen randomly. Just as Robert the Bruce had used this same terrain against superior English forces centuries ago, Wong's tanks were about to demonstrate how geography could defeat technology. The difference was that instead of Scottish Hiltrons, they had 60 tons of British engineering. The lead Kraxan tank suddenly lurched to a stop, its levitation field sputtering. In their drive to adapt to human weapons, the aliens had overcomplicated their already complex systems. Their new shields could now detect and deflect kinetic projectiles, but the power requirements were enormous. They'd compensated by routing power from their propulsion systems, creating a critical vulnerability. Wang's gunner didn't need a computer to capitalize on that vulnerability. The chieftain's gun had been zeroed in on that exact spot the previous night, with range markers carefully painted on burned-out cars along the roadside. The depleted uranium shell struck perfectly, and the Kraxan tank erupted in a spectacular explosion of plasma and twisted metal. Before the other alien tanks could react, more chieftains emerged from hidden positions in the hills. They had spent days practicing this ambush, timing their shots to land simultaneously. The remaining Kraxan vehicles fell in seconds, their advanced sensors overwhelmed by multiple threats from multiple directions. "Clean sweep," Wang reported. "Just like Kasserine Pass taught us. Never enter a valley without securing the high ground." Similar scenes were playing out across the globe as humanity put generations of hard-learned tank warfare lessons to use. In the rice paddies of Vietnam, Type 74 tanks demonstrated how to use waterlogged terrain to mask thermal signatures. In the urban ruins of Berlin, Leopard 1s proved that city fighting was about crew skill and positioning, not technological superiority. At Site Oscar 7, Colonel Chen reviewed the latest tactical innovations her forces had developed. "Show me the new shell modifications," she ordered. Chief Engineer Martinez lifted one of the new rounds. It looked crude, because it was deliberately designed to look crude. "We're calling it the Trojan Horse round," he explained. "The Kraxan have finally figured out how to detect our standard depleted uranium shells, so we've given them exactly what they expect to see." The shell's exterior was rough, almost primitive-looking, but inside was a carefully calculated surprise. When the Kraxan shields detected and deflected the kinetic energy of the shell, they weren't prepared for it to split apart, sending a spray of smaller penetrators through gaps in their energy screen. "Sometimes," Martins grinned, "the best high technology is cleverly disguised low technology." The humans had another advantage the Kraxan couldn't counter: experience. Every tank crew in every nation had trained for years to fight in their specific environment. Swedish tankers knew exactly how to use forests for cover. Israeli crews were masters of desert warfare. Canadian teams could track targets through snowstorms that blinded alien sensors. Commander Vexthor was facing a crisis. His reinforcements were still a month away, and his ground forces were being systematically destroyed by what his training insisted were inferior weapons. Worse, every adaptation his engineers made seemed to create new vulnerabilities for the humans to exploit. "They're using our own assumptions against us," Sub-Commander Zira admitted during a strategic briefing. "We strengthen our shields, they find ways to slip past them. We enhance our sensors, they give us false readings to chase. Every time we adapt, they're already 3 steps ahead with a countermeasure that looks like it was developed 50 years ago." The truth was becoming clear. The humans weren't winning because their technology was superior. They were winning because they understood something the Kraxan had forgotten in their rush to develop ever more advanced weapons. The fundamental principles of armored warfare hadn't changed since tanks first rolled across battlefields over a century ago. Position, timing, coordination, crew training, terrain awareness. The humans had mastered these basics and turned them into an art form. Their primitive weapons were merely tools in the hands of warriors who knew exactly how to use them. In her command center, Colonel Chen received word that the Kraxan were pulling back from multiple engagement zones, consolidating their forces around their main bases. "They're finally learning," she observed, but too late. They came expecting to fight a technological war. Instead, they found themselves in a tactical one. She turned to her staff, pointing to the marked positions on their paper maps. "The Kraxan reinforcements will arrive soon, and they'll have countermeasures for everything we've done so far. That's why it's time for Phase 3. We're going to show them something they've never seen in all their centuries of warfare." "What's that, Colonel?" Chen's smile was grim. "A combined arms assault using nothing but obsolete weapons. Signal all commands. Operation Steel Thunder begins at dawn." As night fell, tank crews across the planet began their preparations. They cleaned guns that had been designed before their parents were born, checked mechanical systems that needed no computers to function, and studied paper maps by flashlight. Tomorrow, they would remind the galaxy that humanity's greatest weapon had never been its technology. It had always been its ability to adapt, improvise, and overcome. The breaking point. The largest tank formation since World War II rolled through the Nevada desert under cover of darkness. Hundreds of engines growled in carefully maintained low tones, their sounds masked by the wind and the distant thunder of an approaching storm. The Kraxen's main Earth base, a sprawling complex of advanced technology and shield generators, lay just 20 miles ahead. Colonel Chen rode in the lead tank, an M60 Patton that had been pulled from the Arizona desert just months ago. Her crew had named it History Lesson, and tonight it would help teach one of the most important lessons in galactic history. All units report ready, her communications officer announced, reading from messages delivered by runners throughout the massive formation. They had gathered tanks from every allied nation. American Pattons, British Chieftains, German Leopards, Soviet T-72s, and more. Each brought their own strengths, their own battle-tested designs, and crews who had trained their entire lives for a moment they never expected would come. Execute Phase 1, Chen ordered. The first indication the Kraxen had of the attack was when their long-range sensors detected a massive dust storm approaching from the east. But this was no natural phenomenon. It was a carefully choreographed screen created by specially modified tanks dragging chains and plates through the desert soil. Behind this curtain of dust, the main assault force moved into position. Commander Vexthor stood in his command center, all four eyes fixed on the tactical displays. Another primitive attempt at deception, he declared, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. They cannot seriously intend to challenge our main base. Our shields are at maximum power, our weapons fully charged. Sir, Sub-Commander Zira interrupted. Ground teams report vibrations. Many vibrations. They're using the dust storm tow. The entire base shuddered as the first wave of shells struck. They weren't aimed at the shields. Instead, they hit the ground around the base's perimeter. Thousands of rounds, precisely targeted to create a specific pattern of impact craters. To the Kraxen, it seemed like a waste of ammunition. Then the second wave hit. These shells were different. They contained no explosives, just dense metal cores. As they struck the previous impact points, they drove deep into the earth beneath the Kraxen shields. The aliens had focused so much on defending against direct attacks that they'd forgotten about the ground beneath their feet. The earth began to shift. The Kraxen's mighty shield generators, their power plants, their sensor arrays, all had been built on what was now becoming unstable ground. As structures began to tilt and power fluctuations rippled through their defensive grid, the true attack began. Tank columns emerged from the dust storm, not in neat rows as the Kraxen might have expected, but in irregular patterns that made targeting difficult. They fired on the move, their shells now aimed at specific weak points identified by weeks of careful observation. The aliens had assumed that primitive humans couldn't possibly coordinate such a precise attack without advanced targeting computers. They were wrong. They're using pre-planned fire zones, Zyra realized, her voice filled with dawning comprehension. Every gun knows exactly where to shoot. Every unit knows exactly where to move. They've choreographed this entire battle like a dance. The Kraxen attempted to respond with their typical tactics, concentrated energy weapon fire and predictive targeting. But the humans had studied their response patterns. Tanks would appear as targets, draw fire, then disappear behind ridges or dust clouds, while others struck from unexpected angles. It was a doctrine developed over a century of armored warfare, refined through countless battles and endless training. In her command tank, Chen watched the battle unfold through specialized periscopes. The Kraxen's energy weapons lit up the dust-filled sky like lightning, but they were increasingly desperate, increasingly random. The aliens were fighting as individuals, each unit trying to respond to the threats it could see. The humans fought as a single organism, every vehicle playing its part in a grand strategy. Second phase, she ordered. Release the fast movers. From hidden positions around the battlefield, lighter tanks, mainly restored Stuart and Chaffee light tanks from World War II, burst into action. They were too small to carry the heavy guns needed to damage Kraxan armor, but that wasn't their purpose. They raced across the battlefield at maximum speed, their tracks kicking up more dust, their movements deliberately erratic. The Kraxan targeting systems, already struggling with the dust and the coordinated main assault, began to falter completely. Their advanced predictive algorithms, designed to track and engage threats moving according to logical patterns, couldn't cope with the chaos of dozens of small vehicles moving in seemingly random directions. In orbit, the Eternal Dawn's sensors registered a critical power surge from the ground base. The constant shield adjustments, the perpetual targeting calculations, the endless attempts to compensate for battlefield conditions their systems weren't designed to handle, it was all proving too much. Full evacuation, Vexthor ordered, his neck membranes nearly black with stress. Get our people out before. The command center's main power failed as the ground beneath it shifted again. Emergency lighting cast an eerie glow over the scenes of chaos as Kraxan personnel abandoned their posts. Outside, human tanks had breached the outer defense perimeter, their guns now firing at point-blank range into critical infrastructure. How? Zyra demanded as she helped her commander toward an evacuation ship. How did they coordinate all this without any modern communication systems? The answer lay in the hundreds of hours of training, the countless planning sessions over paper maps, the deep understanding of tactics that had been passed down through generations of tank commanders. The humans hadn't needed advanced technology to plan and execute this attack. They had something far more powerful: experience, creativity, and the absolute refusal to surrender their world. As dawn broke over the Nevada desert, the dust began to settle. The Kraxan's main Earth base lay in ruins, its mighty shield generators toppled, its weapon emplacements destroyed. Around it sat hundreds of tanks, their ancient guns still warm, their simple mechanical systems having performed flawlessly through the night's battle. Colonel Chen emerged from her tank's hatch, surveying the destruction. A runner approached with a message. Similar attacks on secondary Kraxan bases around the world had been equally successful. The aliens' ground forces were in full retreat, falling back to their ships. Send word to all commands, she ordered. The next phase begins in 12 hours. The Kraxan think they can escape to orbit, but they're about to learn why you should never leave an enemy with access to your supply lines, especially when that enemy has thousands of tanks and nothing left to lose. The battle for Earth's surface was ending. The battle for Earth's orbit was about to begin, and humanity had saved some surprises for that too. Victory in the dust. From the bridge of the Eternal Dawn, Commander Vexthor watched Earth's surface through enhanced imaging systems. The sight below should have been impossible. His mighty ground bases reduced to rubble, his advanced forces scattered, and everywhere the tracks of those primitive tanks marking the Earth like battle scars. But there was still hope. His reinforcement fleet would arrive within hours, and surely the humans couldn't reach his ships in orbit. That's when Sub-Commander Zyra noticed something odd about the sensor readings from their supply lines. Sir, the gravity readings from Supply Base Gamma are fluctuating. Deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, in vast caverns that had been hollowed out decades ago for a very different war, Colonel Chen stood in front of what might have been the most audacious weapon conversion in military history. Around her, engineers made final adjustments to what had once been the launch tubes for nuclear missiles. Now those tubes held something very different: modified tank barrels, bundled together in massive clusters. The Kraxan made two critical mistakes, she explained to the assembled crews. First, they assumed we'd never find a way to reach orbit with our primitive weapons. Second, they built their supply lines using gravity manipulation technology, the same technology they use in their hover tanks. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. The Kraxen's supply ships used focused gravity beams to transport materials between their orbital vessels and ground bases. These beams had to be precisely calibrated. Too strong, and they'd crush their cargo. Too weak, and it would drift off course. The aliens had assumed that humans couldn't possibly understand, let alone manipulate, such advanced technology. But they had forgotten something crucial. Humans had been studying gravity assistance and orbital mechanics for over a century. And while they couldn't replicate the Kraxen's technology, they could certainly disrupt it. All stations report ready, the command center announced. Operation Orbital Slingshot is go. The modified tank guns fired in sequence, sending specially designed shells up through the Kraxen's own gravity beams. The shells weren't meant to reach orbit on their own. Instead, they were calculated to interact with the gravity beams in ways that would amplify their velocity. Each shell's trajectory had been calculated by hand, using principles of physics that had been understood on Earth since Newton's time. In orbit, the first indication that something was wrong came when Supply Base Gamma's gravity beam suddenly pulsed, its carefully maintained field disrupted by the passing shells. The disruption traveled up the beam like a wave, gaining strength as it went. When it reached the supply ship at the top of the beam, the vessel's gravity compensators failed catastrophically. "Impossible," Vexthor whispered as he watched the supply ship tumble out of formation. "They're using our own gravity beams as weapons." "Sir." Zyra's voice was sharp with alarm. Similar disruptions reported at supply bases Alpha, Beta, and Delta. "We're losing control of the entire supply network." The humans hadn't stopped at just disrupting the gravity beams. As the Kraxen ships struggled to maintain their positions, more shells came up through the beams. These carried payloads of simple metal pellets, and now they were reaching orbit, accelerated far beyond their normal velocities by the disrupted gravity fields. Space around Earth became a dangerous garden of expanding metal clouds. The Kraxen's energy shields, designed to stop energy weapons and smart projectiles, struggled to cope with thousands of simple metal fragments moving at extraordinary speeds. Ship after ship reported hull breaches as their shields flickered and failed. "The reinforcement fleet is arriving," Zyra reported, her tone now tinged with something that sounded very much like fear. "But they're receiving our distress signals. They're holding position outside the debris field." On Earth's surface, tank commanders received the news with grim satisfaction. The Kraxen reinforcements, arriving ready to face primitive ground vehicles, instead found their comrade ships being systematically destroyed by what amounted to a cloud of hypervelocity gravel. In the Himalayan command center, Chen received the reports with quiet pride. "Send the message," she ordered, "the one we prepared for this moment." The transmission went out on all frequencies, aimed at both the crippled Kraxen fleet and their hesitating reinforcements. "Your supply lines are cut. Your ground bases are destroyed. Your orbital advantage is compromised. We are willing to accept your complete withdrawal from Earth space. You have 1 hour to decide before we demonstrate what else we can do with primitive technology." It was a bluff, of course. The humans had used almost every trick they had. But the Kraxen didn't know that. All they knew was that these primitives had systematically dismantled their invasion force using weapons that should have been hopelessly obsolete. The response came 43 minutes later. The Kraxen fleet, both the damaged ships and their reinforcements, would withdraw. Their message included something unprecedented in Kraxen history, a formal acknowledgement of defeat. As the alien ships limped away from Earth orbit, Commander Vexthor made his final log entry. "Let it be recorded that the humans are not primitives. They are warriors who understand that technology is merely a tool, not a guarantee of victory. They have taught us a lesson that our empire has long forgotten, that the deadliest weapon is not the most advanced, but the one wielded with the greatest skill and determination." 3 days later, Colonel Chen stood in front of her command staff. The celebrations around the world were still ongoing, but there was work to be done. "The Kraxen will spread word of their defeat," she said. "Other species will learn that Earth's primitive weapons were enough to drive off the most advanced empire in the known galaxy. That reputation will help protect us, but it won't protect us forever." She gestured to the tanks that had won them their victory, their steel hulls scared but proud. "So we'll keep these old warriors ready. We'll remember the lessons they taught us about the difference between technology and skill. And most importantly, we'll remember that humanity's greatest strength isn't in our weapons. It's in our ability to take whatever tools we have and find ways to make them work." The tanks would return to their shelters, maintained and ready. The missile silos would be restored to their original purpose. The world would rebuild. But something fundamental had changed in humanity's understanding of itself. They had faced the most technologically advanced empire in known space, and won not by matching their technology, but by mastering the fundamental principles of warfare that no amount of technological advancement could render obsolete. As news of the victory spread across the galaxy, other spacefaring races took note. The primitive humans, it seemed, were primitive only in their technology, in their tactics, their adaptability, and their sheer determination to survive. They were among the most advanced species anyone had ever encountered. And in classified military academies across the galaxy, a new course began to be taught: Earth's Ancient Weapons, a study in the dangers of technological overconfidence. The course's primary text was the collected battle footage from the Craxan invasion, and its first lesson was always the same: never laugh at an enemy's weapons until you understand exactly what those weapons can do.